So the title of our message today is Make a Dent. Or as we sometimes like to call it in the evolution, MAD. Make a dent, make a difference, MAD. And I want to start off by getting you to ask the person next to you, turn to them right now, look them in the eyes, feel the connection and electricity between the two of you. And I want you to sincerely, mean it with all your heart, ask them, friend, how are you doing? Now, why did I ask you to do this? Well, in studies that have been coming out, scientists are actually realizing that human beings are hardwired for doing kindness. When any of us is kind, generous, or altruistic to someone else, whether it's with our money, our time, our talent, or our energy, even a simple, how are you doing? You know what? Our brain actually releases endorphins, oxytocin, serotonin, all the great, good stuff, neurotransmitters that make us feel happy, joyful, and at peace. Now, these same neurotransmitters actually also cause us to bond with the people that we are showing kindness to. So again, look at your neighbor, smile at them, feel the electricity, and feel how bonded you feel right now in this moment. Because as it turns out, being kind and caring about someone else's life is actually good for us. It is the medicine to our sadness, anxiety, depression, languishing. It is the solution to feeling isolated and alone. But not only that, the more we do kindness, did you know the more addicted to kindness your brain and your person actually becomes? So listen, God has literally designed you, your brain, given you a predisposition to be more kind than self-serving, to be more inclined to be generous than self-preserving, to grow into a better human being rather than to devolve into a selfish person. So listen, being like Jesus, a kind human, God, who made a difference in this world, doesn't actually require a lot. Sometimes as Christians, we have this perception that when it comes to following Jesus, living in God's call, or building God's community here at TiVo, you and me have to be a lot, or have a lot, own a lot to even begin to make a difference to matter in this world. And that's when we start to get overwhelmed. But the truth is, all these, it's all just little acts of kindness every day, every other day, that if all of us begin to do that together, little dents, it adds up to make a big difference. We become happy as individuals. We start to create ripple effects in our community and beyond TiVo. And together, we start to transform the health and the connection of people, culture, and atmospheres in positive ways. How many of you here would love to experience that in 2022? So I'm going to address today 4 ways of thinking that actually stop us from stepping up to make a dent in our world. And we're going to start by looking at Mark 6, at a well-known miracle that is called Jesus Feeds the 5,000. So Mark chapter 6, verse 30, it says here, the apostles rendezvoused with Jesus and reported on all they had done and taught. Jesus said, come off by yourself. Let's take a break and get a little rest. For there was constant coming and going. They didn't even have time to eat. So they got into a boat and went off to a remote place by themselves. Someone saw them going, however, and word got around from the surrounding townspeople, went out on foot running and got there ahead of them. When Jesus arrived, he saw this huge crowd. At the sight of them, his heart broke. Like sheep with no shepherd they were, he went right back to work teaching them. When his disciples thought that this had gone on long enough, it was now quite late in the day, they interrupted. We are a long way out of the country and it is very late. Pronounce a benediction and send all these folks home so that they can get some supper. Jesus said, you do it. Fix supper for them. They replied, are you serious? You want us to go and spend a fortune on food for their supper? But he was quite serious. How many loaves of bread do you have? Take an inventory. That didn't take long, 5 they said, plus 2 fish. Jesus got them all to sit down in groups of 50 or 100. They looked like a patchwork quilt of wildflowers spread out on the green grass. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, lifted his face to heaven in prayer, blessed, broke, and gave the bread to the disciples. And the disciples in turn gave it to the people. He did the same with the fish. They all ate their fill. The disciples gathered 12 baskets of leftovers. More than 5,000 were at the supper. So there are 4 mindsets, listen, 4 attitudes, perspectives that keep you and I from being proactive about kindness in our lives. And the first I want to tell you about today is this thinking, I am too tired. So the Bible tells us that prior to this amazing multiplication of food, the disciples had actually just returned from a ministry trip. And from what is described, it is an extensive trip. Right? The Bible says they rendezvoused with Jesus and reported on all that they had done and taught. Then it was Jesus who said to them, hey, come off by yourself. Let's go take a break and get a little rest. For they had been in constant coming and going. They didn't even have time to eat. So listen, it was tons of people, lots of work, constant coming and going, no leisure time to even eat. Sometimes sounds like our church. So this prompts Jesus to say, all right, guys, awesome job, but all of us need a holiday. So much so that Jesus himself told them, you know what? He himself said, let's go away and take a break. Yay. And so they get into their boat, right? But of course, word about Jesus gets around because he's probably like the most famous person in the region at that time. And before they can even, disembark their ship, catch their breath, a huge crowd has already gathered, going, Jesus, speak to us. Jesus, teach us. Jesus, heal us. Make miracles happen for us. And what does Jesus do? He goes back on his word to give his team a holiday and starts serving the people all over again. Listen, the Bible tells us, right, the disciples are not happy at all. And I love how the Message Bible expresses this. It says there, when the disciples thought this had gone on long enough, they interrupted Jesus. Guys, listen, imagine with me what's happening right here, okay? Jesus is teaching some amazing messages, doing some crazy healings and miracles. But instead of being a part of the amazing stuff that's going on, the change that was being made in the crowd, his disciples decided to interrupt him and go, Jesus, stop. Stop the preaching. Stop the miracles. This has gone on for too long. Wrap up. Send the people home. Whew. I can't even believe they dared to say that to Jesus Christ. But how many here can also sort of relate, right? You know, there are all kinds of reasons why we're too tired to love someone else. Maybe work and responsibilities is draining your energy. Maybe there are things happening in your life and you're struggling. Maybe there's illness in your family, mental health challenges after the past 2 years. You're recovering but not fully recovered. Maybe some of us are going through some life transition, school, identity, relationships. Listen, all these are valid stuff. And we're living in great times where so many of us are learning self-care, how to healthily process our feelings. You know, we're learning that we should get rest when we need rest. However, if tiredness has become our default setting, the excuse we give all the time as to why we can't love, can't serve, or give to someone else, then listen, it might be time to rethink our mental attitudes and ask ourselves, is the thought, I am too tired, stopping us from moving with God? You know, when we first started TiVo back in Kallang days, I remember we had grown to about 15, 20 people, and all of us, we sincerely every week said, we want to live for Jesus and serve our community. But youth, being youth, right? Some of us found it really hard to get up early in the morning to come to church to serve. Some things never change no matter which generation you were from. Now, there were a few in our team that struggled a little more than the rest, and so some of them would wake up late, come in unprepared, rushing in, and then force others to have to cover for them, which wasn't quite fair, right? And of course, by the time they came in, it was quite embarrassing, and they felt like they weren't pulling their weight, which in turn was sometimes, how you get embarrassed, right? Their attitude was sour, and whenever they did duty, they would sulk and whine and complain, right? And so sometimes, occasionally, one person would say, reporting time for ministry is too early. My mind cannot function at 8 a.m. in the morning. Another might comment, the amount of time I've been given, Pastor, to make this excellent for the gathering, for the community event, just isn't realistic. Now, back then, I was a really young leader, and I knew very little about building culture. So before I know it, this mindset of I'm too tired started to spread in our team. And it came to a point where when I looked at our culture, it didn't look like the church we dreamt of building for God. I looked at the work we were doing and I knew that we were underperforming our potential. So to solve our culture problem, the leaders, we came up with an idea to have a ministry and leadership boot camp. And during this boot camp, this was a big idea, okay? We took away everyone's watches and phones. For 4 days, Sue, me, and a few others were the whole team's only timekeepers and pace setters. So every morning, we will wake everyone up, get them to pray, read their Bible. Then we will make some of the teams practice music, prepare slides, and then we would chase them, hurrying them along. And then 30 minutes left, 15 minutes left, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And then we would plan community work stuff on the spot and go and execute it in the community immediately. We packed the 4 days. And at the end of this boot camp, finally, we returned everyone's watches and phones and told them, did you know that in the last 4 days, you slept less than 13, 14 hours? And here is the list of things, the standard of excellence and love for others you were able to give. From then on, for more than a year, no one in TiVo ever dared say that there was not enough time to get something done, or that they were too tired to give God and others their best. Something permanently broke in our mindsets. Now, of course, hang for you, we don't have boot camps anymore. We were youth, and it was a very different time. Now, what we did would probably be called abuse, and we'll get scolded on social media, right? But my point of this story is this. Ever so often, we need to stop and ask ourselves, is my tiredness when it comes to loving others valid? If it is, then go ahead, get help, get rest. You'll do better serving others if you are well rested. But also be evaluative that sometimes I am tired can be a mental habit. A habit of complaining that you and I have that keeps us from growing outside of our comfort zone. A false mindset that traps us in a low level of service to other people. A perception that keeps us from fully participating in what God is doing. You see, if you look at Mark 6, I want you to think for a second, right? Was Jesus as tired as his disciples? Of course he was. Probably more so. But in the moment when the crowds came and the needs of the world around him presented themselves, Jesus chose to expand his capacity to love. He had a holiday lined up, but he went and said, I'm tired, I'm hungry, yes, but I can do a little bit more. You know, his disciples, on the other hand, just for one day, they could have chosen to follow Jesus' example, to be a part of the difference that Jesus was making, but they refused. And instead, they held on to this mindset, I am too tired. And it started to affect the way they loved the crowds. It even affected the way they responded to Jesus. Amen? Now, the second thought that tends to come up for us, besides I am too tired, is let's be practical. So here's what else the disciples said to Jesus, okay? It says here in verse 35 to 36, they said to him, we are a long way out. It's very late. Send these folks off so that they can get some supper. Listen, there's nothing wrong with being practical. Planning, strategizing, being on time, budgeting, eating, these are all necessary concerns, right? It's actually helpful to be pragmatic when we go out to love people. Sometimes doing those things allows us to love people better. But how many of you also know that there's a huge part of love thy neighbor that is not practical at all? That very often, radical love for others is exactly that. It's radical, a bit impractical, somewhat unreasonable. And that sometimes it's exactly that kind of love, that part of love, the radical part, that makes love impactful. I mean, have you ever stopped to ask yourself why we follow Jesus? I mean, it's because his love for us is so radical, so extravagant, so outrageous. We were sinners, and yet he, God, chose to become a human and die for us. And that is why if we've truly experienced God's love, we also start to get a little bit crazy in our love for him. You see, making a dent in this world, in people's lives, isn't always a practical thing. Now, you guys all know Zihan. That's right. Come on, cheer for him. Right? One of our senior leaders. But one of the things he's most known for among the leadership team is that he's the one leader in our team who tends to raise up unexpected leaders in the church. Youth and young adults who were not the most confident, not the most externally and obviously talented when they first joined our community. And that's what he does. But do you know, when Zihan was 16 or 17 years old, I got him to help organize a camp in our church, all right? And he was a very inexperienced youth at the time, also very disorganized. And so the week before, we ended up having a huge backlog on preparation. And the night before the camp, the very night, he had to stay up to finish his part. Now, I was pretty exhausted at night. I've been preparing sessions for the camp, 7 or 8 of them, and I've been supervising the other youth in the team. But he was up, and that time was online chat on the laptop with him. And then close to 3 a.m., I wrote to him like, Zihan, do you think you can settle the rest on your own? And he replies to me, of course, yes, Pastor Ken, I'll settle it. So I'm about to log off and go get my sleep, right? But immediately in that moment, I hear God speak to me, you need to stay up with him until he finishes. My immediate reaction was, seriously, God, how am I going to survive this camp? And I start writing down all the reasons why it's not practical for me to stay up past 3. God, there's nothing else he really needs me for anyway. I should just conserve my energy. I need to be alive to give my best to the rest of the team. But for all my excuses, I could feel the Holy Spirit speaking to me so strongly. You need to be radical in how you love him. Not tomorrow, not another day, but today. So in the end, I messaged Zihan back. I said, you know what? Don't worry, I'll stay out with you until you finish. It was so simple, so impractical. Somewhat it was his fault. But little did I realize it would become a huge turning point in Zihan's life. You see, up to that point, he was not the most reliable youth. But following that camp, he became committed. He used to be a very angry youth, but something in him switched and he began to soften as a person. He started to get serious with God, and he eventually rose up to become a senior leader in our church. And today, he is famous for doing the same thing that I did with his people. Friends, listen, I did it once in one youth's life. He does it all the time. If people in his teams are involved with something, even when he is tired, busy at work, he makes time to be with them. Whether it's the ushers that he's leading in the church experience team or those that he's mentoring, being with people and his team has become his superpower when it comes to raising up leaders. See, again, was it practical for me to stay out with him that night? Is it practical for Zihan to always be up with his team? No. But sometimes making a dent in someone's life isn't practical. It's radical. God asking you to love isn't always going to be reasonable. It will not always be convenient or make common sense. But it's being radical from time to time that can leave a mark in someone else's life. Ready for number 3? The third perception that stops us is this: there's not enough. There isn't enough. So the disciples go to Jesus and tell him to send the people off to get their food. But Jesus replies, Jesus said, you do it. You fix supper for them. And they reply, are you serious? You want us to go and spend a fortune on their food for supper? right? So again, here disciples, they started with, I'm too tired. Then they covered up their tiredness with, Jesus, let's be practical. It's getting late, they're hungry. But I love Jesus. He just has this great way of turning our hidden attitude on its head. He says, no, you do it. You go fix supper for this crowd. And his disciples are stunned. They're like, Jesus, are you for real? This will cost a lot of money. Now, listen, personally for me, right, this mindset that isn't enough is the mindset I struggle with the most. We have a small community here in the Evolution, a youth church. Most of you here are students, which means we never have enough money. Now, once upon a time, we used to have time, because that's what youth are supposed to have, right? Lots of time on your hands. But with school, the way it is nowadays, sometimes it feels we don't even have time on our side anymore. So friends, you are preaching to the choir if you tell me that your resources aren't enough to match your dreams for 2022. The fact is, we don't all have equal access to the same resources. Some of you have time, some of you have energy, some of us have more money, some of us less. But here's an interesting bit from the University of Notre Dame from their Science of Generosity research. Notre Dame found that giving has nothing to do with what we have or don't have. So remember the payoff we talked about earlier, the neurochemicals that get released in your brain when you give, right? Guess what? That payoff has nothing to do with how much resources you give in comparison to someone else. Instead, it has everything to do with giving what you do have. So generosity doesn't have to wait until you are rich, till you have time, till you have resources, till you're working. Listen, in fact, they studied many people over different socio-economic backgrounds, and what they found was that those who were poorer were predominantly happier than those who were richer. Because a higher percentage of those who were poorer were engaged in acts of kindness and generosity more frequently compared to those who were more well off. So, for example, some lower income families, when they weren't working 2 jobs, they were actually helping their neighbors take care of their kids so their friends could go to work. Notre Dame also found that once people obtain a certain basic level of income where we have our needs met and a little bit more to enjoy, so we don't have to worry so much. Do you know that any further increase from that point does not correlate with more happiness? In fact, it starts to flip and become correlated with increasing unhappiness. Because what they found is that the more money people make, if they are not generous with what they already have, they actually become more stressed, more anxious, and increasingly less capable of being generous, and the cycle of stress in their brain and body repeats. So listen, happiness has nothing to do with how much you have right now. It has to do with how generous you are willing to be with what you do have. You are enough right now. You have enough right now to be kind. One of our peeps in TiVo that really inspired me 2 years back was Si Yang. Let's give him a round of applause. Woo! Now, back then he had just graduated from poly and was doing NS, and he was trying to, in the middle of COVID, find freelance film work to make some money because that was his interest. But as you know, during COVID, the media industry went into lockdown, right? So he couldn't really land many jobs that were in the scope of his passion. And he ended up signing up to do Grab delivery. Wow, man. And yet, let me tell you, during this period, Si Yang on his own decided to do a personal Be Nice campaign. He purchased a couple hundred cans of 100 Plus with his own money. He gathered a few friends together and they went around his area distributing cold drinks and notes, little handwritten notes to foreign workers, Grab delivery guys, and essential workers during circuit breaker. You know what? He reminded me that you don't need a lot before you can make a dent. There is always something that we can bring to God. Even when we are tight financially, tight in terms of time and energy, there's always something we have that we can sow into someone else's life. Listen, guys, we cannot let a scarcity mindset stop us from participating in generosity. You see, scarcity is this idea that life is a big competition, a zero-sum game where one person gains, another person loses. It's this belief that the world and its resources are limited, so we need to put ourselves first. And so often, human beings, we let this subconscious limiting mindset determine the extent of our generosity. But really, when it comes to Jesus' way of life, we need to let our generosity determine how we use our limited resources. You see, when Jesus said to the disciples, "You feed them," their response was, "But it will cost us a fortune." Listen. The disciples have been following Jesus around for 2 years now. They had seen God's goodness. They had seen God's unlimited supernatural work. But yet, something limited and old remained in their thinking and their attitude. They were still setting their goals, their vision, and their behavior based on a scarcity mindset. Friends, remember this. There's a big difference between making a dent without God and making a dent with God. The extent of the first will always be limited by the resources you think you have. So you will go, I can only do as much good with as much money as I have, as much time and energy as I have, as much as I can muster out, or as much as I can find in myself. It'll always be limited. But the second, doing life with an unlimited God causes us to be creative. Creative and innovative like Si Yang was. Si Yang didn't go, I'm just an unemployed, poor young person. Instead, he let his generosity determine his creativity. Let your generosity determine your creativity. Now, final mindset we're going to confront, all right? And it's this: it can't be done. So Jesus issues the creative challenge, right? He says to the disciples, "You feed them." The disciples respond, "You can't be serious." Verse 38 says, but he was quite serious. "How many loaves of bread do you have?" Take an inventory. I love this. It didn't take long. I don't know whether it's true or not. Or it was the disciples' attitude, it didn't take that long. Oh, okay, we only have 5 loaves plus 2 fish. I can just imagine the sarcasm dripping from their reply, right? Inside, they must be thinking, man, our leader Jesus has lost it. But remember what has just been happening in their lives prior to this. They had just come back from healing the sick, preaching the gospel, doing signs and wonders on their own with God's power. They were happily reporting to Jesus all the crazy stuff they did. But somehow, attitudes in us run so deep. I'm too tired. Let's be practical. There isn't enough. And let me tell you, entertain these attitudes long enough, eventually will graduate to it can't be done. You see, tiredness, ultra-pragmatism, limitation, and then now skepticism. The Christian term we use for these things from the Bible is called unbelief and faithlessness. Do you know when, guys, the world stops changing? When human beings are faithless. Do you know when the world does change? It's always when someone dares to believe, Christian or not, in something impossible, in something different, in a new way of thinking and doing things in the world. I know that things right now hopefully are probably opening up in Singapore, in other parts of the world. After 2 years of standing still, it's great to be able to move again, right, with our life. But let me say this, it can be tempting though to hunker down and start to think, okay, now is my time. I've got to think only of me and how I progress my life. I am all I have energy for. I need to catch up on the last 2 years that I lost. I need to move on with my life. I need to pave my way in the world after being, weighted down by COVID. But listen, don't become too faithless. Don't become too tired. Don't become too pragmatic. Don't become a skeptic. Because that's when you take yourself out of the running from making an impact. That's when you take yourself out of the running of what Jesus is already doing in the world. You see, friends, it's not that the world isn't going to change. 2,000 years later, we know how this story in the Bible really goes, right? After all that complaining, all the disciples, I'm too tired, it's not practical. Jesus is actually about to do a miracle. An incredible miracle. Jesus is going to feed 5,000 people. So, and listen, the 5,000 is just the men. It's not even counting the women and the children. So scholars say it's probably more like 20,000. You see, the fact is, you couldn't stop God even if you wanted to. With or without you, Jesus is about to change the world. The only question is, will you choose to be a willing participant in the miracle? To be one of the dents that helps to feed your community. So verse 40, it says that Jesus got all of them to sit down in groups of 50 or 100. They looked like a patchwork quilt of wildflowers spread out on the green grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, lifted his face to heaven in prayer, blessed, broke, and gave the bread to the disciples, and the disciples in turn gave it to the people. He did the same with the fish, and they all ate their fill. The disciples actually gathered up 12 baskets of leftovers, and more than 5,000 were at that supper. So listen, despite their attitude, Jesus lets the disciples participate. Despite our attitudes, Jesus lets us participate. But why be forced by God to change the world when we can be willingly involved in the process? So, one last thing about the science of kindness. It turns out that generosity and kindness are not the same as obligation and niceness. In one article that I read, an important distinction is made that nice is being unwilling when we give and do good. Now, we usually do this when we're worried about being liked and trying to fit in, so we try to be nice. And as it turns out, scientists say, when we do good, but actually doing it reluctantly because we feel obligated, our brains don't produce serotonin, oxytocin, and all those good neurotransmitters. In fact, our bodies start to release stress hormones instead. Kindness, on the other hand, is characterized, scientists say, by willingness. A willingness to give when needed, to genuinely offer help even when it's hard. So it's okay that sometimes generosity feels hard. It just mustn't feel reluctant. I think that's why Paul writes, right, in the New Testament, God loves a cheerful giver, that we shouldn't give out obligation or coercion. He was telling neuroscientists where to look. I think this was also the power at work when Israel came together in the Old Testament to build the tabernacle. The Bible tells us all through the wilderness, they complained, they rebelled, there's no water, this is so hard, send us back to Egypt, chapter after chapter. But then suddenly when they came together to build God's house and to contribute whatever they had, the Bible says willingly, suddenly all the complaining stopped. And something changed in the culture and the atmosphere of their community. So what I want to say is this. It is willingness in our generosity that activates the benefits of being kind in your life and in the life of our community. Stay with me, we're going to land now. There is a part of this story about the feeding of the 5,000 that the book of Mark actually does not document. in Mark's version, it just seems like all the disciples had no faith, right? They were all unwilling participants, all complaining, whining. But the Gospel of John actually fills in some missing pieces in our story. John 6, 8-9 says, one of the disciples, it was Andrew. Everybody name your sons Andrew next time. Brother of Simon Peter, who said, there's a little boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But, okay, still a little bit of complaining, but that's a drop in the bucket for a crowd like this. Okay, so here we go. There were actually 2 people who stepped forward to work with Jesus. The first was Andrew. Andrew was as tired as everyone else in the team, as adamant that they had limited resources, but in that moment, he chose to overcome those thoughts and say, here is a little boy who has 5 barley loaves. The second character who stepped forward to work with Jesus was the little boy. You know, when I was growing up in church, right, my leaders used to tell me that the 5 loaves and 2 fish were the boys' lunch. But I'm older and wiser now, right? And I've reflected on the Bible for myself. Listen, I highly doubt this was the boys' lunch, because who on earth eats that much for lunch? I mean, we have hungry boys here in TiVo, but none of them can finish 5 loaves and 2 fish. So what's the explanation? The people who were following Jesus were mostly the poor. So there was no way this one kid could afford that much on his own. Following me here? I suspect what he had was actually what he sold for a living. Which then makes this boy's offering to Jesus, his willingness to be a part of the miracle, even more precious. Because this boy was probably just as tired as everyone else from a whole day, a whole life of selling food to make ends meet. He, of all people, had every reason to be practical. If he gave his food away, not only would he have no earnings, he would have to answer to his parents who had sent him to sell food. He, of all people, had a reason to say, not enough. But the little boy decided to offer what he had to Jesus. And through him, this nameless little boy, with this one act of generosity and faith, a miracle happened. Through Andrew, an adult who decided to usher this little boy to Jesus, a miracle happened. 2 dents of faith transformed their community. And we throw in the signs of kindness. Then Andrew and this little boy's brains got the benefit of more serotonin than the other 11 disciples. Guys, what you have to offer is not too small to matter. You know, to all the youth and adults here, I want to encourage you this year, step up with what you have. You know, youth, this is your time of life to decide your attitudes and mindsets that you're going to live by. Don't let tiredness, becoming overly practical, or low self-esteem or imposter syndrome stop you. You know, learn to lean into idealism and adaptability that you have as a young person. Use it to serve God willingly. Use it to take on responsibility for the future. You know, for the adults here in TiVo, you are so important to the future of the evolution. Yes, youth are the future, but they need Andrews to step up to bring them to Jesus. You know, I had amazing mentors, still do, who step up all the time to bring me to Jesus, to give me confidence, to do life with me, to show me the way as a youth. You know, to show me the way to Jesus and how to serve Him as a youth and now as an adult. I then did the same for you. Youth may be the focus of the evolution, but without our adults who serve as Andrews in youth's lives, youth's dreams are just dreams. They need you to help their dreams become a reality. So I want to encourage all of you here. We all matter. We all bring different things to Jesus, different things to one another, different things to our community. None of it is ever too small to matter. And when you give of yourself willingly to build God's dream community together, all our little dents can be part of a bigger miracle. So this year, let's decide. We're not going to say these 4 things. We're not going to say, I'm too tired. We're not going to say, let's be practical. We're not going to say, there isn't enough. We're not going to say, it cannot be done. Let's put a stop to low-level, stingy thinking in our lives. Let's transform our world with our willingness to be kind. Because it is willingness in our generosity that activates the benefits of being kind in your life and in our community. Amen.